recording. Started recording, so I will go and change the slides, okay?
Yeah. Oops.
Start.
Yeah, but I'm not on the spotlight. We've got Jean. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, and welcome to another of our Harif online events. On behalf of Lawrence and myself, I'd like to welcome you to Harif. For those who don't know us, we are the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, and we aim to raise awareness of the history and culture of these Jews. Please do check out our website, which is www.harif.org. If you are not on the mailing list, please do join us and keep up to date with our activities. We have a sister website as well called Point of No Return, which keeps you up to date with the news. This evening is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded to YouTube and will be sent out to everybody on the mailing list. Tonight, we are marking the 65th anniversary of the Suez expulsion. Following the Suez crisis, some 25,000 Jews left their homes in Egypt. Some were given 24 hours to leave, others just a week. For others still, the 1956 Suez crisis was the writing on the wall, telling them that they had no future in Egypt. Admittedly, the exact anniversary is not until October of this year, but since we are lucky enough to have a global Zoom audience for our lockdown lectures, I thought it was an opportunity too good to miss to hear stories from those of you who've lived through this period. We have asked several speakers to share their memories, and I know many of you will have your own opinions and stories of your own, so I would encourage you to write your comments in the chat box, which is probably at the bottom of your screen. I think it's called Converse in French. If you have something particularly relevant or original to add, please do write it in there. I would like to thank Viviane Akerlevy of the AAHA La Grosse Pomme for her help in finding speakers, and also Dicky Smuha for his help. But first, I would like to call on Alec Nacamuli of the UK-based Association of Jews from Egypt, and himself a refugee from Egypt after Suez, to give us the historical background to the 1956 crisis. Over to you, Alec.
Alec, could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, now let me take the slides forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Lawrence. I think first, before we go into the Suez crisis itself, I think we ought to look at the global political context at the time, because you must view the Suez crisis within the context of this global geopolitical context. So in Egypt, we had President Nasser, who had ousted Naguib in 1954, and he was striving to establish himself as the leader across the Arab world with his vision of pan-Arab socialism, and his main rival was Prime Minister Nouri el-Said in Iraq. We have the Suez Canal, and at that time, every day there was 1.2 million barrels of oil every day who was going through by tanker towards Europe. But the revenues accrued largely to the shareholders and not much to Egypt. Then we have the two superpowers, the US, President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Foster Dulles, and the Soviet Union, the Khrushchev-Bulganin duo. And we are at the height of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. And these both superpowers are vying for influence in the Middle East. And the USSR, the Soviet Union, had been selling arms to Nasser via Czechoslovakia since 1955. In France, we have the socialist Prime Minister Guy Mollet, and he was at odds with Egypt, who was supporting the FLN in the Algerian war with clandestine arms shipments. And Mollet himself viewed Nasser's book, Philosophy of the Revolution, as his Mein Kampf. And France and Israel were close. France had delivered Mirage fighter planes to Israel. Eden in the UK was already sick, smarting from the retreat of British troops from the canal in 1952, and he viewed Nasser as a Mussolini. And we should also note that Dulles and Eden hated each other. And as for the Egypt-Israel relationship, Nasser was constantly supporting Fedayeen raids from Gaza, attacking civilian populations and interfering with Israeli ships transiting through the canal. So this is the global context. Let's now look at the build-up to the war. On the 19th of July, 1956, the United States were upset by the fact that Egypt had recognized the People's Republic of China, so Communist China, so they withdrew financial support for the Aswan Dam. On the 26th of July, we had a long speech by Nasser in Alexandria. He had positioned troops near the canal, and when Nasser pronounced Ferdinand de Lesseps, the troops seized control of the canal and the canal was nationalized. Shareholders were compensated at the closing price on the Paris Stock Exchange, and the canal was closed to Israeli ships, and Nasser also closed the Tiran Straits. Eden was actually hosting a dinner with King Faisal II of Iraq and Nouri el-Said when he heard the news. And the Iraqis advised him to hit Nasser very hard, go for him. And Eden also had cautious support from Gaitskell, the leader of the labor opposition. And the French cabinet decided to intervene militarily 3 days later. Britain was initially reluctant to include Israel. There were some unpleasant remarks about hooked-nosed boys joining, but plans for the tripartite agreement were finalized at a villa in Sèvres, a faubourg of Paris, between the 16th and the 21st of October. So on the Israeli side, we had Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, and Shimon Peres. On the French side was Guy Mollet, the Prime Minister, and the Ministre des Affaires étrangères, Christian Pinault, plus a British representative in constant link with Downing Street. And the plan was as follows. Israel would invade Egypt, nicknamed Operation Kadesh. France and the UK would land in Egypt, Operation Musketeer, enforce a ceasefire, separate Egypt and Israel, and seize control of the canal. The ultimate objective was even to depose Nasser and replace him with a puppet leader. Originally, also, the military plan was to attack Alexandria, but then they decided to attack Port Said, which would require less troops. And at this point, unfortunately, world attention was distracted by the Hungarian Uprising on the 23rd of October and the subsequent Russian invasion. So the war itself, on the 29th of October, Israel launched the attack by dropping paratroopers led by future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon on the Mitla Pass, which you can see on the map, which is a road hub. And that way they were cutting off supplies to the Egyptian troops in Sinai. And at the same time, they launched land and air attacks from Eilat and air raids. The French and the British had concentrated planes and troops and ships in Cyprus and Malta, and had also positioned aircraft carriers and battleships. On the 30th of October, France and the UK issued an ultimatum to both sides to withdraw 16 kilometers either side of the canal. And on the 31st of October, the French and the Brits dropped paratroopers from Cyprus and Malta on Port Said. Interesting to note that the French Air Force and the paratroopers were led by General Charles and Massu of later Algerian 13th of May 58 putsch fame. Egypt then immediately sunk 47 ships loaded with cement to block the canal, thus stopping the oil flow. On the 6th of November, British and French troops landed in Port Said. Nasser declared a people's war, ordering soldiers to wear civilian clothes and distributing weapons to civilians to magnify the propaganda effect that invaders were killing civilians. And Port Said, you will mostly remember, was declared a martyr city. There was also bombing of military objectives, airports around Cairo and Alexandria. And I very vividly, I was 13 at the time, remember the blackout. And in the meantime, Israel was pursuing its advance in the Sinai, capturing Gaza, Sharm el-Sheikh, and taking thousands of prisoners. I remember when we arrived in France at the end of December 56, of seeing photos in Paris Match of shoes that the Egyptian soldiers had abandoned because they could run quicker bare feet. Anyway, international pressure was building up. Khrushchev threatened to unleash nuclear weapons over France and the UK. Eisenhower and Dulles told him to calm down, that they also had nuclear warheads positioned in Europe close to Moscow, but they were actually furious that Eden and the UK had not warned them of the attack. Eden, in fact, had not even notified Gaitskell, the leader of the opposition. And Eisenhower stated, the US cannot condemn Soviet invasion of Hungary whilst condoning occupation of Egypt. And the US applied economic pressure, threatening to dump the UK government sterling bonds it held. They also positioned the Sixth Fleet Navy between the UK and French battleships and the Egyptian seashore, saying that if you shoot on Egypt, you're actually bombing US troops. So there was an attempt for a ceasefire at the United Nations Security Council, which was rejected thanks to the French and the UK veto. But for the first time, an emergency meeting of the General Assembly was called, which ordered a ceasefire by a majority of 64-5. The ceasefire became effective on the 7th of November at 2 o'clock in the morning, and Israel continued to advance in the Sinai until the last minute. So the war ended. If we look at the casualties, the UK lost 16 soldiers, France 10, Israel 172. There are no official figures for Egypt, but it is estimated at between 2,000 to 4,000, including civilians. And France and the UK eventually withdrew troops on the 22nd of December, and they were replaced by the famous United Nations troops. So what were the consequences? So I think we can all see it was a military victory, but a political defeat. In the UK, Eden, who was very sick, resigned in January 57. Now, if you read British history books, they all talk about decline post-Suez. I think that is wrong. The UK was exhausted by World War II, were losing the empire. They were declining. You could argue that Suez was perhaps just the straw that broke the camel's back, particularly in terms of loss of reputation. France, they felt betrayed by the US. And there was a very severe degradation of relationship with the US. They felt betrayed. And that is what convinced de Gaulle that France could not rely on allies for defense, and his withdrawal from NATO and the development of the independent nuclear force de frappe. Israel was confirmed as the strongest military power in the Middle East, and they withdrew from the Sinai in March 57 when the canal and the Straits of Tiran were reopened. And as for Egypt, well, it reinforced Nasser's stature as leader of the Arab world. UK and French citizens were expelled from Egypt. alongside, as Lynn said, around 25 to 30,000 Jews over the following year and a half. Companies were nationalized, assets were seized, and this is what we will be hearing from our next speakers. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alec, for that excellent summary. As you said, there were British and French nationals in Egypt who were, some of them summarily expelled. But Nasser also took his revenge against Jews of other nationalities or no nationality. Anyway, let's get a picture of what it felt like to be in Egypt in 1956. So I would like to call on Lucienne Carasso-Bulot. Please, can you unmute yourself?
No, I've got to unmute you first. Okay, can you unmute yourself now, Lucienne?
Can't hear you.
No, she's not unmuted yet.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Lovely.
can. We can.
Okay.
So,
All right. Well, I was born in Alexandria, and all my grandparents came from Salonika. On my mother's side, the Avditis and the Botons came around 1880. My Carasso grandparents were Spanish citizens, remained in Salonika until the 20th century. And my paternal grandmother, Lucia, was pregnant with my father and came to Alexandria in 1911 to join her brothers and sisters, just before the Greeks took over Salonika. My Carasso grandfather, I think, was prevented from joining her by the war. I never knew him or my other grandfather, who died when my mother was 2 years old. Both my parents grew up poor, without fathers. My mother was one of 7. Here is the wedding picture of my parents, Fortuné de Botton and Léon Carasso. My uncles and my father were self-made men. My father had become a ship agent and broker and was very successful and was not shy to show it. He owned the only corvette in Alexandria and would race in the Corniche with it. My parents and I, am an only child, lived with my maternal grandmother, Nonna Sol, and some uncles and aunts and a cousin. We lived in a villa in Rushdi Pasha, away from the center of town. We later moved to 2 apartments in Mustafa Pasha. At home, we spoke Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, as well as French and Italian. My parents' generation and mine spoke French. We'd use Arabic with the servants. My grandmother, Lucia, only spoke Ladino. It was the only language I could communicate with her in. She almost spoke in proverbs. She had a proverb for every occasion, which was sometimes unnerving. For elementary school, I went to the Lycée de l'Union Juive pour l'Enseignement, which was a private Jewish French lycée. I had a very happy childhood growing up with 7 first cousins. Some of them are on the call here. You can see a picture of my 10th birthday. My father would order from Delice Pastry this cake of a ship, which was made of almond brittle. But later that year, the Suez Canal crisis broke out. My father was interned, as well as one of my uncles. A lot of the students and teachers left. All the lay French teachers were expelled from Egypt, but nuns stayed. So most of the Jews who remained went to Catholic school. I went to Notre Dame de Sion. 2 years later, when the French teachers were allowed back, we all went to the Lycée Français, which was then called the Lycée Al-Hurriya, which means freedom. So you could fail French and pass to the next class, but if you failed Arabic, you had to repeat the year. My parents and I left after I passed the Erdadeya, which is a secondary diploma in Arabic. I also had a group religious initiation in 1959 at our beautiful Eliyahu Hanabi synagogue. It was a type of bat mitzvah, although we all looked like Catholic girls at their communion. All the girls wore long white dresses and white veils. You can see it in the picture. And I think Marlène Barqui is on this call, on this Zoom, and she's there too. We all wanted to leave, but Nonna Sol refused to leave Alexandria, where she was born. So the whole family waited until she passed away. We waited for 5 years. So in a sense, our experience was a little different from other people. In the meantime, my father was slowly liquidating and selling his cars and some of my mother's jewelry. My parents and I finally left in August 1961 when I was 15 and a half. We were Egyptian citizens. In order to get an exit visa, we had to relinquish our nationality. And what's funny is that 6 months after we left, there was an announcement in the Egyptian newspapers that we were stripped of our nationality because we didn't come back. The day before leaving, I had a last reunion with my few remaining friends. One of my friends brought me a box of chocolates. When we came to the port to meet our ship, the Massalia, my mother and I were taken to a room to be searched by a woman. She wanted to take my chocolates because I guess she was suspicious of them. So I offered her to take some, and she was obviously embarrassed because she let me keep them. When it came to inspection of our luggage, we had 40 large leather suitcases. One inspector told my mother and me to open all of them. We started to open them when another inspector came and said, "Carasso, everything is fine. Close the suitcases and go." It was good because we had silverware and 2 oriental carpets in the suitcases, which were forbidden. Then another inspector wanted to open a small metal box which was sealed, which I later learned contained some of my mother's jewelry. I'm sure that my father paid a fortune because another inspector came and told the first inspector, "Can't you see that it is sealed by the government? You can't open it. Go, yalla, yalla." So we were rushed to the ship. My father was worried that somebody would recognize him in the port and that something might go wrong. So once we boarded, he took a bottle of scotch to our cabin and started drinking it from the bottle. I had never seen him drink that way. He didn't come on deck until the ship sailed. About the property that we left behind, my parents didn't own real estate. As I mentioned, they were entrepreneurs, so their main assets were the thriving business that they had founded. My uncle's import and export business was sequestered. My oldest uncle was told to get up from his desk by the man from the government who went to sit at his desk and said, "Get out, this is now my office." It really broke my uncle's heart. I remember his coming to see my grandmothers and crying. He died about a year later. My father's main ship agency was a Spanish line which had several ships plying the Mediterranean, loading and discharging cargoes. While he was interned, his ship chandler, who was a Muslim, went to Madrid and told the ship owners that my father could no longer help them because he was Jewish. So they gave him the agency on the spot. So when my father came out of internment, his main business was gone. Whatever was left of his business was supposedly purchased by Mohammed Fayed of Harrod fame, you know, Dodi's father, although Fayed didn't pay him what he had agreed to pay, and my father was suing him at the time we left. The contents of our apartment was bought by an army officer for whatever he wanted to pay. I also had a beautiful Lionel train set. We tried to sell it at Rivoli, one of the fancy department stores. As the employees couldn't figure out how to operate it, every Friday afternoon after school, I would sit in the store window and make it run. We weren't able to sell it and eventually left it to the army officer. After leaving, we went to live in Genoa, Italy. We rented a beautiful apartment on the best avenue in Genoa, bought furniture, and started to establish my father's business. In the meantime, we went to Rome to apply for a visa to the United States. The business had not yet started to do well when we received the visa. We closed the office, sold all the furniture, we packed our bags and came to New York on the Leonardo da Vinci. We already had the tickets because my father had bought first-class tickets on Italian line to Rio de Janeiro because we had visas to go to Brazil. In New York, my father, who was an independent sort of man, didn't want to be an employee. He started his own business as a shipbroker, but it was very hard, lots of competition. He worked very hard and was eventually able to make something of a living, but he was never able to really be successful the way he was in Egypt. But he never looked back. My parents were proud to become Americans and were always grateful to be in the United States, especially for my sake. In 2004, I went back to Egypt with a group from the AAHA, the Alexandria Amicale. I had mixed feelings about going, but talked myself into going by remembering that my mother had an unusual necklace that I particularly loved, which I think my father sold during those 5 years we waited before leaving. I decided that I want to find it or one like it. I talk about it in my book, Growing Up Jewish in Alexandria, the story of a Sephardic family's exodus from Egypt. During that trip, we visited the Eliyahu Hanabi synagogue and I took some pictures. You can see how splendid the synagogue looked in 2014, even though it hadn't yet been restored. And I think you saw the slide.
Yeah,
Yes, we
I'll
did.
go back to it. Don't worry. I've got to get it the right way. There we are.
Yeah, it was gorgeous. I mean, the ceiling was peeling, but otherwise it was really gorgeous. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucienne. And just a reminder that Lucienne is the author of a book, Growing Up Jewish in Alexandria, the story of a Sephardic family's exodus from Egypt. And note that she was an Egyptian. Her family were Egyptian citizens, but they obviously did not deserve the protection of the Egyptian state. Next, I would like to call on Jean Nagar. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Jean. I think we'll spotlight you. Yes. Okay, so Jean, you left a lot earlier than Lucienne. Can you tell me what the circumstances were? Obviously, Egypt still plays a very large part in your life because you wrote 2 books. Both of them are set in Egypt, or at least partly set in Egypt. They're Sipping from the Nile and Footprints on the Heart. And you were 19 when you left. So what do you remember most from that time?
Well, it was, excuse me, it was very disconcerting because I had been at boarding school in England. My mother was a Smuha, my father a Moseri. My father's family had been in Egypt for about 200 years. And, so my mother had gone to school in England and we were sent there. I was very excited to go. It was wonderful. I went when I was 13 and I would come home for the holidays, but basically for about a month a year. Then I was to leave school. This was a big deal. I was very excited about it. And we left the whole family, larger family, my grandparents, my Smuha grandparents, my cousins and uncles and aunts had all been summering in Europe. And everybody was still in Europe, but my father said he needed to get back. He was worried about things. So we went back early. And I had been very disappointed that I was not going to be able to go to university in England because my parents did not feel that was something they wanted me to do. So I joined the British Council for a university course. And the books had all arrived, and all of a sudden, and so I was beginning to get excited about it. I had left school, I was a grown-up, I had this thing happening, and all of a sudden, everything stopped. And that's really where, for me, the whole thing started, because I was not politically conscious of what was going on around me. I was a schoolgirl who had, been in an English boarding school, and I came, and there was suddenly everything came to a grinding halt. And my father was extremely worried because I can't see myself, so I don't know what's happening, but I wanted to show a picture of the house where I grew up. Does it show?
Lift it up a bit more. No, you need to be slightly higher up, Jean. We can only see the top of the frame.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Just
Lovely,
about,
yes,
yes, we
perfect.
can.
Yeah. So I grew up in that house, which my grandfather built, and which, you know, was rather prominent. It was on the borders of the Nile. My father's family was a prominent banking family. And my grandmother and my maiden aunt also lived there with us. And my father was very worried and spoke to the Italian consulate. We had Italian passports. We were Italian citizens. And he spoke to the consulate, and they said, we have somewhere where we can hide you. So he arranged for us to go because my grandmother and my aunt would not move. So he took my mother, my sister, who was 9, and myself, and my brother was, who is between my sister and me, was at boarding school in England. So he was not with us. And we went to the Italian schools, and we were there for several weeks. And it was a very strange period because basically we were, you know, we slept on thin mattresses on concrete floors. We were all crowded together, the women in one part, the men in another. And we were there for all of that time. We could hear outside the walls, we could hear screaming and shouting and yelling. We knew that there were fires happening. We knew that there were big demonstrations. My father went to his office, and like Lucien's uncle, he was basically told that we now had somebody who was a custodian in the office, and he could come, but he was not going to do anything. So he used to go just to see what was going on, and then he would pop in and visit my grandmother and my aunt, and then he would come back to the Italian schools. So it was a very strange period, and when we left, we thought that now we would be leaving to go to Europe, where the rest of the family was. They had never come back. We did not leave for 9 months because every time my father went to get a visa, he got the visa, but there were no planes flying, and vice versa. He would get tickets for the plane and there was no visa. So, I mean, that's really where it all started for me, because everything stopped and we had no idea how dangerous it was or whether we were going to be, you know, I thought we were going to die. We all thought we were going to die. We thought we would never escape, we would never get out, and there was going to be major massacres in Cairo. So,
and this was 1957.
This was 1956, 57. It started in 56. We had gone back, I think, a few days before the Suez crisis. And then we were there for most of 1957.
Right. So when you finally got out, it was 1957, sort of 9
Yes.
months after Suez. Right. And you were, what about your family's assets? Were they sequestrated?
Yes, they were. They were sequestrated.
Even though you were Italian national?
Yes, and like Lucien's family, we left with a whole bunch of brown suitcases, leather suitcases, and didn't know, well, we knew we were not coming back. And my parents were very positive. They were wonderful, very positive people. And they always, you know, looked ahead and tried to tell us that there was going to be a wonderful life ahead. But to us, we left this beautiful house that we'd grown up in. We didn't know where we would be or what would happen after. We knew they'd left everything behind.
Right.
We were allowed, my mother used to pack one suitcase at a time, and she would pack it with, if we're allowed to take one suitcase, we'll take this one. So put in your most precious things. And if we're allowed 2 suitcases, we can take this one also. And we had 5 or 6 suitcases that were packed that way, ready to go.
Mhm. Gosh, what a story. Yeah. And can you just tell very quickly the story of your friends, the Castros?
Yes, well, along the Nile, there were all of these big houses, and 2 houses down from us, there was the Castro house, and they were friends of ours. And when I came to America, one of my closest friends was Bunny Sheriff, who had been Bunny Castro and who later became Bunny Joseph. She married Lord Joseph, and she and I she was like an older sister to me. She was so wonderful to me when I first came to America. And she told me this story, which is that she had gone to she had gone to a lecture by Madame Sadat. She thought it would be very interesting, and she said it was fascinating. And when she went to congratulate Mrs. Sadat at the end of the lecture, they got talking and they got really interested in each other. And Mrs. Sadat said to her, "You really must come and visit us in Egypt. You must come and stay at our house. Beti Betak," which in Arabic means my house is your house. The irony, of course, was that it really was. It had been her parents' house. It had been their house.
Yes, I think that is the most amazing story. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your memories with us, Jean. I think we can go to Arlette now. Arlette Loomis.
Yes, how do you do all? Well,
hello there.
Yes, I would like to thank you first, Lynn, for inviting me to reminisce with you one of the most important events of my adolescence.
well, I thank Vivian Akalivi, because without her, we wouldn't have been introduced.
Yeah. Arlette, can I just ask a favor? As you've got quite a few slides, tell me next slide when you want me to go forward.
Yeah.
Okay. So right now, I just want to say, having listened to Lucienne, that that my experience is indeed similar to that of so many who were exiled, but it seems inevitable for all of us that who lived for all through these years, for more than 65 years, that we should, old age, reminisce and think back on our journey. So I would like to thank you and all those like Yves Fedida, who have are collecting all this testimony of all the Jews who have been expelled from the Middle East and the Muslim countries. So now I would like to start from the beginning. I have photo 1 and 2. It's the first 2 pictures. Can you show them? That's my father's family and my mother's, who have not been in Egypt for many generations. Their family, my father's family, was Sephardic, and they came from Salonika. My grandfather was born in Salonika, and my grandmother in Jerusalem, Palestine. They wandered through the Ottoman Empire, ending up in Alexandria in the first decade of the 20th century. My father was born in 1911 and was the first one who was born in Egypt, and they spoke Ladino at home. But my maternal grandparents were Ashkenazi Jews, and they were escaping pogroms from Ukraine and from Russia, and they too settled in Port Said for a better life, thanks to the Suez Canal that brought prosperity to the region, and for, of course, mingling with a cosmopolitan society that would be more tolerant of Jews. So both sides of the family rapidly prospered in Egypt, in particular those who were in the trade of cotton. And from both sides of the family, I had uncles and granduncles who were in the trade business of cotton. My maternal grandfather with his son had opened a popular drogerie standard in the chic downtown area of Alexandria. And that picture is of my mother and standing in front of a drogerie. And the drogerie Del Mar is an older one where my grandfather had worked first in Poseid before he moved to Alexandria and opened his own drugstore. So as you can see, my father and mother were of different, very different Jewish background, but they met in Alexandria, in a city that was cosmopolitan and multilingual, and communicated with people of different religions and backgrounds. And this is the diversity, of course, and tolerance that helped us later on to adjust easily more in our new surroundings. And we then spoke French at home. My sister and I went to the Lycée Français. And of course, there we were friends with Greek, Italian, Turkish, Armenian, Egyptian pupils. So here's a picture of the next picture is my mother and my mother in Stanley Beach. And that's how in 1937, but we too throughout from 1937 all the way to 57 to 59 when we left, that was the life we had of going to the beach and Stanley Beach, CD Beach. Then during the colder months, we went to the famous Smoha Club and to a beautiful resort in the desert that was called the Desert Home. And of course, every year the highlight was the holiday of Sham el Nessim that was celebrating the beginning of spring. And it was always an exciting adventure to go through the desert roads, going to the villages of my village of my maternal uncle, it's Simbelawen. That's one picture there, where we had the gamoos, the black cows of Egypt. And then we had, and then the other time we would go to Sanhu, which was a village where my paternal granduncle had a farm, and we would be 15, 20 members of a family enjoying living together. So it all ended up very abruptly in 1956. And we all started leaving those family members who were British or who had a British or French passport had to leave first. And my father was stateless, so we stayed. Again, the parents protected their children so that we as children did not feel what was happening. And but we felt it, in the periphery. For example, in November, there was an air raid from the Israeli force or whatever, or maybe it was the British. And as we had to leave the building, instead of turning off the light, I turned on the light of the veranda a giorno, and immediately there were screams of Yehudi, Yehudi, and they were saying that well, lots of people coming up the staircase with knives. And it is thanks to the loyalty of the doorman, the Bawab, who told them, no, we don't have Jews in this building, that we were saved. That was one personal thing when we felt that life was dangerous, and we had to leave our apartment for a few months before things calmed down and when we came back. Then at school, of course, we went back to the Lycée La Liberté, La Horeya, and every week there were the classmates, friends who left, who disappeared. Some of them never said goodbye. Others where we would have parties for them. And then it was as we were dancing and singing and having a last time together, we knew that we would not see them again, or hardly. For the adults, that was even more precarious. My father didn't leave because we were not expelled, but he knew that life was not possible as things were more and more difficult and there were no future for the children. But he had a contract with the government to build a warehouse. He was a building contractor, building private houses, no more at that time, but he had with the government that he had started 2 or 3 years earlier. And that was a warehouse at the port, at the harbor, which was forbidden zone for the Jews. So every day he had to show a special permit. And as he was building that warehouse, he was realizing every morning that the workers had sabotaged, destroyed what they had done the previous day. And then, so he had a contract with penalties for incomplete job that was not done on time. And everybody was telling him, forget about it, just leave. But he was stubborn, principled, and he said, no, I will finish that. And then I'm going to sue the government. He actually sued the government. And and so anyway, we knew that we had to leave. And meanwhile, my mother was, of course, filling up huge trunks because we knew we could take belongings and clothes, but not money. And finally, we finished and we left without knowing if we were going to go to which country we had chosen. We had exit visa for Rio de Janeiro too, like Lucien, and for New York City. And we were debating which way to go. So the day we left, that was a very memorable experience. We were leaving on the Esperia boat, which had been the boat to go with for many generations. It was there forever, doing the shuttle with Greece, for example. So as we arrived, we have all the luggage there, 2 big trunks filled with clothes and books and things wrapped in it. And also, so as we arrived, a female official takes me to a room and she bodily searches me, which was the most overwhelmingly painful and humiliating experience and unforgettable. And then the other customers, the custom officials would take the tubes of toothpaste and squeeze them and take the jars of facial cream and clean them up to see if there was any contraband jewelry in it. And we were just, in suspense because one of the bottles of perfume and lotions had been sealed by my grandfather, who had the drogerie Standard. And in one of them, there was my mother's diamond ring. And fortunately, they did not unseal these bottles. And we were safe and we were able to start our journey to our new life in the United States eventually. So that's it. So after we had 2 months, difficult months in Paris to receive the designation of stateless refugees. And after that, we chose to come to the United States, which was another type of experience.
Okay, yeah, I know you did go back to Egypt and you've got some pictures which we could very quickly run through, very quickly, yes.
Very quickly, I want
the end.
Yeah, I would like to say that.
No.
Oh, you have to go these ones?
No, towards the end.
Okay,
Yes.
fine.
So we were in Israel because in 1992, just after the first Iraqi war, invited by the Israeli military because my husband is a scientist and had developed rapid detection tests for biological weapons, and they were afraid of biological war from Iraq. After that, we went to Eilat and we just crossed. You see the picture of my husband and my daughter. We just walked from Eilat to Taba. That was such an experience. I wish it would be so that easy to solve the boundaries and the problems between one country and another. Mm-hmm. We went to Cairo rapidly, but what was important is that we went back to Alexandria. And I had my cousin, second cousin, Gloris, who is the sister of Carmen and Esther Weinstein, who had been the president of the community of Egypt in Cairo, etc., etc. And she, with her perfect Arabic, had the driver take me to the different sites, the temple, the school, but essentially to my house, to my apartment. And there, the people were the same. It seemed that time had stood still. The Bawab, the concierge, remembered my name. The hairdresser came and said that he remembered even the address, the address of my grandmother who had died in 1948. The garage owner took me inside to his office, opened his drawer and brings out a receipt of my father, signed by my father, who for repair work on his Oldsmobile that he had left in 1958 or 59. So they were so warm, they were so open. It seemed so wonderful to see and they all said how life was better when the Jews were there. And of course. And I left with such, having my American husband and American daughter with us. It was something to show them how people were so wonderful, warm, generous, and it is really, unfortunately, governments or religious fanatics that make life so, unfortunately, intolerable all these decades later. So that's it,
Thank you very much indeed, Arlette. That was amazing. I'd like to go to Myra Platt.
Oh, right, I did.
For
Robert, sorry, let me just go change this. All right, sorry, I think it's Robert next. It's my mistake.
I'm sorry, we have to rush you a little bit because we're running a little bit out of time. But
we're not losing anyone. Take your time. Sorry, I put Myra. I think it was Robert. My mistake.
Yeah. So.
Okay, Myra, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thanks, Myra.
I'm asking you to, Myra, can you unmute?
There we go. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. It was being blocked. Okay.
Oh, okay. Maybe we can spotlight because she has.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So
yes, can you tell us a little bit of your story? Yes. Yes.
So I think I was younger than everybody else so far, but my sister, my twin, and I, we were 5 years old when we left Egypt. And it was toward the end of 1957, 58. And we went from Cairo, where we were born. And my family, my parents, my mother and my father were also born in Egypt. And my mother's family was a long time in Egypt, probably back at the time when they were building the pyramids. That was that far back. But her family went along with the Moors to Spain and stayed in Spain until the 1800s and then came back to Egypt. On my father's side of the family, they came to Egypt from southern Russia, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire. And my father's father made his way down through Salonika into Cairo, where he met my grandmother. And my early life in Cairo was very much filled with cousins and grandmother and great grandmother and aunts and uncles. We were all very, very close. And we've stayed close to this day. Our summers were spent up at Ras El Bar on the Mediterranean, where we would go up with the entire family. I remember all my aunts and uncles who would join us with all their children. And we just spent our time enjoying the water, playing living in the cabanas and playing with each other from morning till night. And at Wrestle Bar was a man who would come by with a horse called Bondo. And I know all my cousins are going to know this and laugh about this, but this was one of the features of our day, was to all get on top of Bondo, 5 of us at once. And because we were tiny and probably weighed about 30 pounds each. So we'd get rides on Bondo. We also, after that, we would come back to Cairo, and the life was very, very much surrounded by family. My mother's father was a spice merchant who lived, was fairly successful, actually probably quite successful. And they lived on Solomon Pasha and had a lovely apartment. We had a very nice life. Our days in Cairo were spent, my mother would walk us over to the gardens of Ezbekia, where we'd meet our other cousins and our other aunts, and spend the day in the gardens, also playing with our little cousins. It was a beautiful life as we recall it. And I'm going to mention, because one of my other cousins is watching the show too, one of the fun things we had was lukmades that they used to sell on the street corner. And to this day, we all remember it, all the cousins do. So actually, when they came to visit us in New York, 50 years later, there was a Greek restaurant in the city that made lukmades. And the first place we went to was all of us came into the restaurant, and we ordered that dessert for ourselves. So it was a wonderful, kind of a nice way to remember a time that for us was a beautiful time, but I know for our parents was a very, very difficult time. I also do have memories of us putting up the dark violet crepe paper up against the windows to black out our houses from during the war, when the bombs were falling and the planes were flying overhead. And we know it was a very, very tense time. My father was a doctor, as was his brother, my uncle. And so we did not have so much property to lose. It was really that they just took, our material possessions. And when we left on the boat, we basically had just the few suitcases, as everybody else did. And we went to France. We went to Paris to wait for our visas to either go to the United States or to Australia. We had applications at both, and Australia came first. But I wanted to go back a little bit and say that, this is my cousin who's asking me a question. Can
I just ask you, what nationality did you hold?
We held Egyptian. We were Egyptian.
Nationality.
Yes,
right.
Yes. And they kicked us out even though we were Egyptian. I know that one of my other cousins, the family had significant holdings that were all confiscated. Factories, anybody who owned properties, that property was confiscated. Those businesses were confiscated. I know that later on, many, many years, decades later, there was a move to try to recompense some of the Jews who had lost some of their properties. And so I know that the Egyptian government was and continues to try to make it up, to try to bring the Jews back to Egypt. I don't think any of us will go back, but at least
yes, sorry to stop you there, but actually talking of property, our next speaker actually has managed to get some of his property restituted. So if you don't mind, we'll go to Bob Nagar, and ask him how he did it. Or perhaps ask his advice as to what to do.
Okay, and as for previous things, Robert, can you tell me when you want me to go on to the next slide?
Okay, very good, Lawrence, thank you very much. Well, after all these great stories, my presentation is going to be a little bit drier, but let's go ahead and see what it's all about. Lawrence, there we are. It's going to be about retrieving sequestrated property in Egypt. And I feel I can talk about this with a little bit of confidence because I've been told by more than one person that I'm probably one of the only ones, if not the only person, single person who has reappropriated sequestrated properties and managed to sell them. And in the process made excellent friends in Egypt whom I would have never met otherwise. How did it all start? Well, it's quite simple. I left Egypt when I was 17 in 1956. My parents stayed until 1964. 1956, I was 17 years old with a British passport. That's why I was kicked out by my father in a hurry. My parents held an Italian passport and made it to England. I had no idea of what our family's properties were. We didn't talk about this in the family. It was accepted that we had properties, but kids of 17 years old didn't have a right to know where, how, and why. Anyway, in 2003, I got a check for $30,000, which just fell on me. I didn't know where it came from, except that it came from the Bank of Alexandria. There was no explanation with it. And well, I went back to people I still knew in Alexandria, and I was told that there were the rents for 45 or 47 years or however long it was for one of our buildings in the center of Alexandria. I thought, well, if I get rents, it means that the building is still under our name. If it's still not under our name, it can be reappropriated. And if it can be reappropriated, it can be sold. So this is where the whole saga started. And let me tell you, it started 18 years ago and still going on. Now, let's see what the processes are, because this is what I'm fairly often asked. How did you manage? And people think, oh, well, you know, we've been told by somebody here and there that they could do that in 2 years, and it's no problem. You don't even have to go to Egypt. Well, that's all bump. Let me tell you about it. I've been through the whole process and still going on. Well, first of all, let's see what sequestration versus nationalization means. Sequestration is when the sequestration authorities take your buildings and tell you, hey, look, you can get it back under these conditions. And there's a list of conditions which, if you meet these conditions, the property will be returned to you. Nationalization is no return to owner, but payment of compensation. That's another story. I'll stick to the sequestration part of it. If you have, no, Lawrence, go back, please. Thank you. If you own properties in Egypt and they were sequestrated, you have a very unwelcome partner, which is the government. Basically, what happened is that when Nasser sequestrated all properties, he had to have them run by somebody, so he gave them to insurance companies, which by that time had been nationalized, of course. But the companies said, hey, look, it's all very well, but there are so many of them. We have no personnel, nor enough people or knowledge to run all this, and not enough money, certainly. So Nasser, out of the goodness of his heart, said, well, this is all very easy. Take 33% ownership of the properties and collect all rents, which of course he had no right to do since the buildings were not his, but that was a secondary point. So now, you are saddled with a 33% ownership by government insurance companies. Lawrence, next one, please. Well, what are the essential requirements? Essential requirements are time, patience, one hell of a lot of stamina and few illusions. If you start with illusions, you're done. If you start thinking that you have no personal involvement in this and that the lawyer will do everything for you, forget it. Because you're going to meet a lot of people in Egypt, and the people you're going to meet, government officials, judges, lawyers, whatever it is, they want to know and feel that you as a person and your family as a background has a personal involvement in Egypt. You were in Egypt. You know a little bit of Egypt. And please go back, Lawrence.
Sorry. I was admitting someone. I pressed the button. Sorry.
So it's in Egypt, as you know, as you possibly know if you've lived there, it's a person-to-person relation. It's a love relation between two people. If you're not personally involved, you are still a family, a foreign family, Jewish family somewhere in the boondocks outside of Egypt. You will get nothing, whatever you try. You have to select the right lawyers. I went through 27 of them. Believe me, it was a difficult choice to make, but I found one. But if I hadn't been there to help him, he wouldn't have been able to do a quarter of what we've done. And you need local intermediaries. Incidentally, the reason I got these $30,000 in 2003 were that our property was in the hands of a lady whom perhaps some of you have heard about, the biggest thief in Egypt, who had two sons, both of them lawyers, just as thieving so-and-sos as the mother was. And there was a fight between the two brothers to decide who would inherit our properties, to soi-disant give them back to their rightful owners. Well, one of them got them through, the mother decided that one of them would get it. And the other brother was so enraged that to make life difficult with to his brother, he sent me these $30,000, which I would never have set a foot in Egypt if I hadn't received that money. I didn't know what we had. So anyway, so selection of the right lawyers and of local intermediaries. You can't do anything without a very well-connected local intermediary. Forget your lawyer, he has a job to do. The local intermediary is the one who's going to put you in contact with a lot of people who you will like, they will like you. You will have a network of people whom you can work with. You need basic knowledge of Arabic. Why? Because once you get in contact with somebody, you say, Sabah al-Khair, it'll change your relation immediately. If you don't speak a word of Arabic, it won't get you anywhere. You need to have that personal relation. And then you have to enjoy challenge, Egyptian humor, local friendships, and lifestyles. Because as one of you said earlier, you will be invited everywhere. They're like that. They're very hospitable. They love the idea that, you know, they have got a Jewish man who was in Egypt in their home. They talk to him in Arabic. It makes a different relation, and things move. Thank you, Lawrence. Next slide. What do you need as documentations to start? You need to have proof of property ownership. You need to have purchased the documents which prove that your family has bought the building or the buildings, and that you can find through the cadastre. The cadastres in Egypt are still organized the British way, very well organized. And I've found documents going back to the end of the 19th century, 1856, when my forefathers started buying land, 1890, 1896, feasible. It needs time. It needs a lot of personal relations. It needs a lot of sugaring, but you can get everything you need. You need every one of the heirs' powers of attorney. Why? Well, on my grandmother's side, there were 14 brothers and sisters. On my grandfather's side, exactly the same. Imagine 14 families. If every family sent one person, it would be impossible to manage. So there's got to be one or at most two people representing the family. And then the government officials which you will meet will equate properties with families, with people who are still in some ways attached to Egypt. You have to get a proof of rightful heirdom. In other words, a family tree. You have to get a family tree from the person who bought or who built the houses or the buildings to today. That means finding the death certificates of every one of your forefathers and of the heirs. On my side, with 14 families, it took me 4 years. I didn't know 3/4 of the people who were my cousins. I didn't know where they were, what they were, who they were, and what they were doing. It was an interesting thing. So to get death certificates from Europe is no problem. From the States, from Australia, from South America is no problem. You wouldn't believe it, but from Egypt is no problem either. We have no access to the synagogues, libraries, but if you have the right connections, if you know where to go, if you know how to go about it, you can get death certificates of my forefathers were Egyptians, or at least some of them were Egyptians, and I found everything. And you have to gather every living heir's proof of life. That's a bit more difficult because when you speak to a cousin in Australia who says, what are you going to give me for that? I say, absolutely nothing. I don't know. Maybe something, maybe nothing. But you'll have to move from wherever you are to wherever there is an Egyptian consulate to make sure that they know that you're alive and to have a certificate of life. Not easy, but feasible. You then have to have all these beautiful documents registered through what is called Ilam Warasa, which is essentially an official recognition of your family tree. Now, that seems easy. That took 5 years for a very simple reason, is that most of my cousins' family name, mostly women who got married, were not equatable in Arabic to an easy way of writing it. Nagar is easy, Levi is easy, but there are some names where it's difficult to find the J's and the P's and the B's in Arabic. So on many documents, you have a same person which is referred to with different names. You have to prove to the authorities that all these names and all this way of writing comes back to one person. For example, Moses, Moise, Musa, it doesn't equate unless you have official recognition of the fact. Whoa, and after that, you have to discover your property's history. 3 of our buildings were illegally sold, of course, by the sequestration to third parties. These third parties had nothing to do with the previous owner. So you have to convince these people to sell back the property to the rightful owners or to sell it to people who would like to buy it. Next slide, please, Lawrence. Then you have to find a buyer. That's easy. Since you're going to sell your buildings at peanut prices, finding buyers is no problem. You put an advert and you have 1,500 people within 5 seconds. But when he knows, the only people who know the difficulty of owning a building previously owned by a Jewish family, there may be 1, there may be 2, but no more than that. Because the person who is going to buy your building has to have an official acceptance of his legal documents, which means he has to be Egyptian, he has to be Muslim, he has to have a reason to buy that building and not just out of fantasy. Then he's got to get people out of the buildings. This is easy. You pay them $100,000. Imagine that most of these people who are in these apartments have never paid rent for the past 60 years. They're not going to be happy. So you give them £100,000 to the person who lives there, and he's going to leave the building. But in between the last week before he leaves the building, his cousin is going to move in, or his uncle, or his sister, or whatever it is, and he's got to start the whole process again. He's got to face legal lawsuits. Why? If there are companies in that building, they're going to question every one of your documents through lawsuits. Long, long process. And then he's got to get rid of the 33% government ownership. None of us can do that, none. There's only going to be a local person who can do it, and probably a government official. Then you have to define an acceptable sales price. That's easy, that's easy. If you put £1 million deposit in an Egyptian bank, you're guaranteed a 12% interest rate. Well, knowing that all the process which we have to go through takes about 10 to 15 years, it means that you'll have to sell your building at 10% or less, or much less of its real value. But who cares? I mean, it's money coming in without you having to pay anything. Very interesting process. Then you have to negotiate and finalize a sales document. Well, if you've gone through the 15 or 18 or 20 years of all the previous documents which you had to do, that is peanuts. It's really peanuts. In the process, I've made excellent friends in Egypt. Most of all, I thought they would hate me, but the person who bought our buildings have adopted me as a son, a brother, whatever it is. I'm at home with them, and I live with them when I go to Egypt. They're great people. Egyptians are fantastic. Politics is something different. Next slide, please. If you want to know more about it, I've written 3 books about it. First of all, Chronique Alexandrine. It's all in French, I'm sorry. Chronique Alexandrine. When you walk around the streets of Alexandria, of Cairo, of wherever, Damanhur, or where, if you look with a sense of humor to what happens under your eyes in the streets, you will bend down, you will bend double laughing. There's always something extremely funny. When I go to Egypt about twice a year, and I wrote these little adventures, daily adventures, to my friends and family. And one of them said, well, why don't you write them all up in a book? And I had over 100 of these little adventures. And believe me, that book, I've been told, and I have I've had quite a few readers for that, thought it very funny. Then I got so involved in the whole process that I wondered why, apart from the Suez Canal crisis, why were we thrown out of Egypt? And I went through the whole history of between 1860, when my forefathers started buying land and buildings and all the rest of it, to today, to find the reason, apart from the Suez Canal and the state of Israel, what made Egyptians hate us. And believe me, I found so many things which I didn't know about, because basically when we left Egypt, we were kids. We had no idea, and we were living on the margin of Egyptians. Now that I know this family, and I know many other families, especially in the countryside, they tell me their story, the way they saw us. And believe me, it's something very interesting, very interesting. So it's a semi-historical book, which basically is the history of Egypt through the eyes of my family and through the eyes of the family who bought my buildings. Because not all of them, but at least one, and 2 others are on the way to being sold. But would you believe it? The person who bought this building, his father happened to be, his grandfather happened to be a peasant, a fallah on the property of my grandfather, which just linked us. And it's really, it's a wonderful relation. And then another question, another book which you've all written in a way or another. Mais d'où êtes-vous, monsieur? Where do you come from? We've all been asked that question, every one of us. And once you tell your answer is, I come from Egypt, then the doors are wide open for a long, long, long story, which isn't finished yet. So there it is. And if you want to know more, I'm at your disposal.
Robert, can I ask two questions quickly? First of all, what was your hair color when you tried to recover the property when you first started? And secondly, did you have to pay any money under the table?
Well, start with your first question, which I didn't hear.
What was your hair color when you started the adventure?
Graying on the sides, but quite a few more than I have today. No. Let me be quite clear about this. I have going to Egypt for me today. At the beginning, I was very much I was a little bit worried, especially having to deal with that thief lawyer who's a rogue. It took me 3 years to get out of his clutches, but I didn't know whether I was safe or not, because he's a bastard in every sense of the word. So the first 3 years were no fun, or at least cautious. Then, when I met that family, life changed for me, and I go to Egypt to have a holiday from my wife and family. It's taken them to Egypt, but they can't feel. I mean, my wife is French, my kids were born in Switzerland or so. They have no idea what Egypt is all about. I can talk my tongue out, they won't understand. So it really is, believe me, it's a lot of fun. And and as to money under the table, everything came out of that $30,000. I didn't spend one dime from my pocket. Thank you, Lynn. That was
Thank you very much.
Okay,
thank you. And thank you, Mira, for telling your story as well.
Shall I unmute all the speakers now? And then perhaps have unmute and then a Q&A. If you send your questions on the chat, Lynn will ask them.
Yes, okay. No, that was absolutely fascinating. I know we've gone over time. We've been going for about an hour and a half, but we still have over 190 people on the call. So please do stay if you're still interested, and we'll just carry on talking a little bit. Are there any?
Alec, do you want to unmute?
Anyone wants to speak?
I've unmuted Alec and Arlette.
I just would like to thank everyone. It was so interesting and so, for me, emotional to say that, because I don't have the opportunity too often to speak to ex-Alexandrian, except Viviane, of course, but not many others.
Yes. And, well, maybe you'll write a book as well, Arlette.
I think every one of us has a story. I mean, I could call that a tapestry where each one of our lives is a knot that connects and make a beautiful, beautiful design that should never be undone. And
okay, lovely. Thank you. I think Ida wants to say.
I'm trying to unmute the speakers first. Let me unmute the speakers first. I think that's
I'd like to correct something, if I may.
Yes, sure.
Because I saw that there was a message that said that because the synagogues burnt down in Livorno, that's why there were families that took Italian nationality. But as it happens, my family really was from Livorno, and there are now Mosseris still in Livorno, where they went after the Spanish Inquisition and before Egypt.
Right. Oh, we know you're a genuine Italian.
I'm genuinely Italian.
Came in the chat here. All of you were from very nice middle-class, wealthy families. What happened to the Jews who were sort of the working class Jews?
I suppose the Karaites, or the people who lived in the Jewish quarter.
Yeah, what happened to them? What was their experience?
I think they went to Israel.
Many of them did, yes.
Many of them did, yes.
Yeah.
This is where, if I may interrupt, this is where the book which is Alexandrie 1860-2017, I think will give you another view of the Jewish community also, whereby our families represented not the majority of Jews. Our wealthy families, our well-to-do families were a minority. But the others, unfortunately, there are quite a few of them who didn't do as well as we did.
Right. Were we mostly in Cairo, or were we also in Alexandria?
But much more in Cairo than in Alexandria. But there were a lot of Jews in the countryside. A lot of Jews in the countryside. Damanhur, Zadig. There were a lot of Jews everywhere in Egypt.
Right. I think
Ida wants to.
Ida, yes, and we do have a Karaite Jew actually on the call. Maybe we can hear from him later. Ida first.
Hi, so I just wanted to say, I find this all amazing. I'm one of the only cousins or children not to be born in Egypt. All my first cousins were all born in Egypt. I went to Egypt in last February when there was the renovation of the synagogue, and it's actually where my parents were married, which was amazing for me. But I just wanted to tell a little story. My mother, she was from Cairo, my father was from Alexandria. My father was quite, what I understand, quite wealthy, worked for a Price Waterhouse in those days. And he had bought my mother a beautiful diamond engagement ring. And obviously when they had to leave, they weren't allowed to take anything, as everybody said. But from what I'm hearing is people did actually manage to get stuff out. My mother left her diamond ring with a relative who had married a non-Jew, and she had stayed in Cairo. And this relative had said, don't worry, when we come to Europe, we'll bring you the diamond ring. So of course my mum left the diamond ring. Anyway, we're now 60 years down the road. This aunt has since been to Europe, never bought the ring. When I was in Cairo, just in the last trip, when I went with the organization, I met the daughter of the lady who had my ring, who had my mother's ring. Yes. And I wanted to ask her if she still had that diamond ring. Of course, you would have said no. And my husband at the time said to me, don't even bring it up, don't go there. And the other thing I just wanted to say was, what from this trip, which I absolutely loved because everyone was speaking French and Italian and Arabic, and and I was picking up stuff. What I got from all these Egyptian Jews is there wasn't one person who said anything negative about what had happened. They'd all had an amazing life. There was no recriminations, there was no hatred. And I found that actually unbelievably humbling that what you all went through, what I'm hearing of your stories, there's not one negativity from anyone. And I'd like to say, that's a real inspiration for my generation, to hear that. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Vivian and then the partner, I think.
Yeah.
But I think there were people who were really pining away for going back to Egypt and regretted the lives that they had.
Yes.
Some moved on, but others were unhappy about it.
Yes.
Yeah, about diamond rings, I didn't talk about it, but when we got on the ship, we were on the deck, and this Greek man came and handed my mother something that was like all sorts of a little bundle, and it turns out it was her engagement ring. And obviously my father had paid the trip to Athens, to Piraeus, I guess. But there were ways, but you had to know and to have the courage to do it.
Fantastic. Have we got Vivian?
Vivian
Akalivi.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
No, that's not the Vivian I thought it was.
Sorry. Oh.
Yeah. That's
Levana there.
Vivian
Levana.
Ettinghausen. Yes, I
That's
know.
right. That key.
Sorry,
Can you wait just a second and we'll have Levana first.
sorry, I did the wrong
Yeah.
Vivian. I was told to unmute Vivian. Sorry.
Too many Vivians.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, there are lots of Vivians around.
Okay.
Yeah. No, we'll come to you in a minute.
You've got
Levana?
Levana's there, yes.
Yes.
Somebody just wrote.
Hi, Levana. Bonsoir.
Bonsoir, c'est vraiment magnifique. Écoute, ce que tu fais, it's very, very, very good, very nice.
Thank you. Thank
Well,
you.
So somebody asked why nobody is talking about the Jews in prison in 56 and 57. I don't know why they didn't, but I know that thousands of them were in prison at Jewish schools. And I know that I saw Viviane Eskenazi. I know that her father were in prison, not for weeks, but for months.
Yes, I think that's the Vivian we have.
It would be
Yes.
good if she says something.
We will go back to Vivian now. Yes.
Vivian,
Hello.
Vivian.
Yes, you are Vivian Ashkenazi, aren't you?
No, Ettinghausen,
Yes.
Baki.
Okay, but you were never Ashkenazi.
No, but I did know people who went to prison. I would
Right.
say hundreds rather than thousands, but there were a lot who were in prison, then had to go straight to the boat. What I wanted to say is I listened with great interest, but the experiences were very different. I gasped when somebody said she went away with 40 suitcases. We had 3 days to leave Egypt, which were extended through a friend in the police to 5 days. And we were given an army kit bag each, where we had just, the clothes we were standing in an army kit bag, and we could take nothing. The flat was taken away. We were terrified because my father was on a blacklist as he'd been a Zionist all his life. We were warned not to hide any jewelry or anything. We were terrified. So we didn't take anything precious, just 10 Egyptian pounds and the kit bag, and arrived in England. However, we were nicely dressed and we arrived at the same time as the Hungarian refugees, exactly at the same time. And we saw those women and children coming out of planes. We were in a military airport, and they were coming out literally in rags with sometimes bandages. And we felt very lucky to
Yes.
to have left Egypt safe and sound with our kit bags. I wish I had had the 40 suitcase, but I didn't hear other people having to leave in 3 days' time. And, I'm sure we weren't the only ones.
And you were British, were you?
My mother was British.
Your mother was British. And were you taken to a camp?
When we arrived in England, we were
Right.
taken to Kidderminster.
Kidderminster.
It was just before Christmas, and
Yes.
our first experience with our totally unsuitable smart clothes.
Yes.
In the
indeed, I
icy-
heard that.
And yes, we were in Kidderminster for a while. So that was my experience. And I
Yeah.
wanted to say hello to my cousin Marlene, who's also watching from America.
Okay, so that's lovely. Thank you for sharing that with us, Vivian. I think Alec wants to have a word.
Yeah, just coming back to, I think it was Ida who said that on the trip when we returned to Alexandria for the re-inauguration of the Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue,
Yes.
nobody had a bad word to say and no anger. But remember that those who made that trip left as mainly children,
Yes.
aged probably from 10 to 20. And most of the speakers said how our parents shielded us from all the aggravation and all the anxiety. So I think our generation just sees this through rosy eyes, and we had a lovely life, but remember the anxiety and what our parents had to live through.
Yeah.
Great. Yes.
Next.
Yeah, the gentleman who's called Mikveh Israel. I'm sure that's not his real name.
My name is Abra Gabai. I was born in Cairo.
In Cairo.
In Cairo. And somebody mentioned that how come we don't talk about the people who were interned in prison camps? Well, I'm one of them. In 1967, the Six-Day War, they rounded up all the men and the boys. I was a boy, I was in high school. And so we were 4 brothers and we were in prison camps. And we were there for 3 years, not months, 3 years. And it was horrible. So thank God, we are very grateful to God for being free here in the United States. But also somebody mentioned something very important, is that we are trained, we are brought up not to have hatred in our heart. Even the Torah says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Therefore, even though we suffer tremendously, nevertheless, we are not bearing that hatred. Also, we have to distinguish between the policies of the government and the people, the Egyptian. The Egyptian people, as everybody mentioned before, nice, very hospitable in general, very poor, many of them ignorant, not educated, but nevertheless, they have a good heart. And so we have to make a distinction. So bottom line really is that we hear beautiful stories in the 1940s and 50s and 1930s and 20s, but when we hear the story about under Nasser in the 60s and 70s, well, by that time it was finished, there was almost nobody in the 70s onward, and then we see the contrast between the beautiful life that we had of our parents particularly, and what we as younger people suffered under Nasser there. But again, I want to repeat one more time to conclude that we are not to carry hatred in our heart.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay,
thank you
very much.
Maya
yes.
Next.
Maya Evans.
Hello, thank you everyone. Very inspiring. I just wanted to respond to Viviane, who wanted to hear about other people who had to leave in a short time. My uncle Isaac Soussi, who was a French national, was given 48 hours to leave and was escorted on board of a ship with handcuffs, and all his property and his apartment and his business was taken. And he really never overcame that loss, because when they arrived in Paris, he was very sick and ended up losing and being paralyzed and lots of things. Anyway, I'm writing here and there.
Writing your book.
Oh, I'm writing little pieces here and there, little stuff. I usually write poetry, but anyway, thank you very much. And
thank you for sharing that with us.
We've got Daniel Abel and then Dori.
Hello to everyone.
Yeah. Can we just hear from David Ovadia, who's the Karaite?
Okay, I'll get,
yeah.
okay. Danielle first, then Dori, and then
David. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't know whether anybody went through Paris. My auntie was working at the Hayas, and she actually, yes, directing people from Egypt to America. She started working there in 1962 for a few years. Now, I lived in Manchester, so I suppose some people who are the list of people there, I suppose they lived in England. I wonder whether they knew some of my friends there, including Renée Hodari, who also had to leave, but she told me she had 4 hours to leave. And my sister-in-law comes also from Egypt. Her family of Menashe, they had a pharmaceutical plant in Cairo, I think it was, and they were given very little time to leave. They went one morning and everything was sealed, so they had to go and left everything behind. They went to Paris, they left everything behind. So yes, it was not easy.
Not easy.
All of them.
And I think it's a good thing you mentioned Hayas, and in fact, we should mention the agencies that actually helped the refugees when they left Egypt, and they kept them going when they arrived in Europe or America.
Yes.
David Ovadia.
David Ovadia, if you're there, would you like to say a few words?
I'm here.
Yeah, hello there.
Well, I'm David Ovadia, living in San Francisco, Bay Area, and we have a Karaite community from Egypt, mostly, that are in the Bay Area, and we have people spread out throughout the United States, all the way down in LA, in the East Coast, all over. We're not a large number, but we are still surviving in here, and we continue to grow and develop. We have one synagogue in Daly City that we hold services on a continuous basis, and we established the Karaite Jews of America basically back in 1982-83. I left Egypt when I was 12-year-old in November 1962. We ended up going on a ship Lydia, and the experience that everybody has to experience, and they already stated, I don't need to go over that, but it's similar as far as all the searching and everything else. But one thing was kind of interesting in my case. I remember my mother, when we ended up getting up on the ship, going to our little cabin, one of the officer came and knocked on the door and told my mother, look, I'm going to take you back unless you give me bakshish. You know, and my mother said, well, we already searched us. You got everything. How am I going to pay you? But why don't you do this? Give me your name, your address, and as soon as I land, I'll send you the money. And they left us. And that was an interesting psychology that my mother used to work.
You got away with it.
Yeah. As far as some other memory, I remember my grandfather had to leave in 1956 and my uncles, and they were very short notice. In our case, we were lucky because we left in 62, and it was through my mother. She was helping a lot of other people, but she convinced my father to leave. So,
and did you leave as a refugee at that point?
We left as a refugee, that's correct. A stateless person as a refugee, and we ended up going to, with the help of the Hayes, ended up going to Paris. We stayed there for 5 months. Then we ended up coming to San Francisco, and I have a lot of, obviously, relatives in Israel and families, but the majority of the Karaite Jews are living in Israel. There may be around 40,000 over there. In the United States, maybe in the neighborhood of 2,000. And there are people in France and Australia and South America. They're spread all over right now.
The Jewish story, absolutely.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Yes.
Well, it's very exciting for us to have people from California, from Italy, from Israel, from all over the place.
Now we've got Dory.
Yeah. Can I just say, Vivian Akalivi, who helped so much to put this together, she has a refugee certificate from the UN. Isn't that right, Vivian? And it's the only one I know of. And in fact, I used it in my own book. But if any of you have any interesting documents, Laissez-Passer, whatever it is, photographs, the Museum of the Diaspora, which used to be known as, the Museum of the Jewish People used to be known as Bet HaTfutzot, Museum of the Diaspora, would be very interested to get photographs of your documents. And I left the email of the gentleman in charge. His name is Chaim Guzeli, and his email is chaim@bh.org.il. If anyone wants to.
Right, and if anyone wants to go there for coffee afterwards, we'll meet you there tonight.
Yeah, that's Groppy. We're going to Groppy. Thank you, Mira. Yes, if you would ask your mother, that would be wonderful.
Okay,
wonderful.
I think Dory has been waiting very patiently.
Okay, Dory, your turn.
Good evening. Thank you. Wonderful stories to hear, but typically Jewish stories just happen to be in Egypt could have been in Hungary or Germany. Anyway, I have an anecdote and a question. My anecdote is that I used to visit Egypt quite a lot in the late 80s on business. And I used to avoid spending the weekend there. But on one occasion, I did spend the weekend there. And what do you do on a Friday night? I wasn't very far away from the Adley Street Synagogue. There weren't, of course, many Jews left, local Jews left, but there was a fair number, I wouldn't say thousands, but maybe a few dozen or a couple of hundred Jews who were there from Israel or from America on all kinds of projects. So when I arrived in Shul Friday night, there were a couple of old local Jews, but essentially we were all the foreigners. And a young man from America, I think, was leading the service. And we were standing there, and he came to Kiddush, and then we were talking late 80s, and he came to the Litziat Mitzrayim, and it all stopped, and he turned around, and we all had a good giggle. Litziat Mitzrayim, and we were there. We'd gone back to Egypt. Anyway, I must mention my father. We went on holiday for the first time in soon after the peace treaty was signed. We flew by El Al, or Sun Air, or whatever it was, the subsidiary was called. And my dad observed when we got back to Tel Aviv, we came from Israel. He observed that it took the Jews then 40 years to leave Egypt, and it took us 40 minutes. But anyway, my question is to the speakers, the main speakers, but to anybody who can comment, is how did the Jews leave Egypt if they had Egyptian passports, and even if they were stripped of their citizenship? How do they get visas or entry into the European countries who were not known to be that friendly?
Good question. Who wants to answer that?
France was accepting. France stepped up to the plate and took many refugees from Egypt, many of the Jews from Egypt. And we stayed as stateless, basically stateless refugees. And Highest did a tremendous effort to get us all sent to get us visas to the United States, or to, we ended up in Australia. Many of my cousins ended up in the United States, and others went to Israel, others went to Brazil. So,
and to Canada also. Canada, Argentina, Australia, were opening their doors, thanks to the Highest, to Brazil, of course, for immigration. I thought it was more difficult to go to any country in Europe unless you had the previous passport that was British or French or Italian. If you were stateless, you were just going to France, to Paris, in transition to another country.
This is my question: stateless or Egyptian nationals? That was my question. Of course, you've got Italian passport. I expect to go.
Sorry, can we let Vivian speak?
Vivian Levy, please.
And apologies, Vivian. I had 5 Vivians on the call, and I kept unmuting the wrong one.
They actually, I had 5 Vivian in my class at the Lycée Français, in the same classroom, because Vivian Lee was very, very popular at that time. So a lot of our parents called us Vivian. Anyway, I'd like to say a couple of things. Number one, if you had a French or British passport, and it's true, you were often given 2 or 3 days, or maybe up to 5 days to pack up and leave. But the French and the British did send boats to take all of their citizens out of Egypt. That's number one. That was only in 56. If you left later, and when you filled out different documents, you had to tell, for instance, if you went to the American embassy to tell them that you would like to immigrate to the United States, which we did we left in 1961, you had to go through a European country. That's how you ended up in a European country, because they were helping you get to a pied-à-terre somewhere. And usually it was either France or sometimes Italy, France or England. And then afterwards, once you were in Europe, you had to fill out again all of the documents to go to the United States. usually with some kind of a sponsor. So this is how the European connection. And also, Levana, you can tell me, but apparently 55% of the Jews from Egypt actually ended up in Israel. I did not know. I thought it was much less, but it turns out that it's 55%. That's all I, and it's only also, the last thing I want to mention is the people who were incarcerated. It's true that in 1956, 57, my uncle was incarcerated with Lucienne's father and with her cousin, Monsieur de Botton. And, but they were not, I believe, they were not very harshly treated. Yes, they were there. There were a lot of them in small quarters and all that. But once they were, my uncle stayed for 3 months and then was given 7 days because he was a lawyer and he had as some clients who were involved with the Zionist movement. They gave him 7 days to just finish with his law office and then leave. But and Rabbi Gabay is correct in saying that in 1967, a lot of the men between the age of 18 and 75 were harshly treated. All the men were incarcerated. There is a famous book that came out 3 years ago, because one of them is Ovadia Yerushalmi, who was also incarcerated, and it was translated in French. And everything that happened in that prison was very well documented. And the Red Cross, it's a fascinating book, especially with all of the addendums at the end, where the Red Cross who went to visit them indicated and documented every single aches and pains that every single one of those prisoners had to go through for 3 years, some of them. And it is true that some of them, and they were only allowed out because a very kind official from the Spanish embassy, or I'm not sure if it's the ambassador or I don't know exactly his title, paid $5,000 per prisoner to free them. And usually they were taken from the prison with the handcuffs straight to the boat or the airplane. Okay, thank you so much, Lynn, and all of the.
Thank you, Vivian, for everything. Yes, so I just wanted to mention before we finish that Giselle Littman, who was on the call, I don't know if she's still there, she's also written about, people who went through the experience in 1967 of being in prison. And her biography, it's in French, but its autobiography is very interesting and well worth reading. So I think we've been here for about 2 hours. It feels like 2 minutes because I think it's been so interesting.
I think it'd be fun to have a follow-on call.
Yeah, and this has been a kind of reunion of the Egyptian Jewish diaspora. And I'm so pleased that you all came from all corners of the world. And I'd like to thank Vivian again and Dicky Smuha. I'd like to thank all our speakers, Mira, Arlette, Jean, Lucienne, and Robert or Bob. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll come back for the next event. We have an event called Why is this Sephardi Seder different? And that's next week. And then we go to Kurdistan and we go to Burma and all sorts of interesting places.
We've got Pesach. So. What I'm going to do is allow everyone to unmute themselves. Everyone can say,
and you can say, hello to long lost cousins.
And that's the Ashkenazi on the call. Thank you for sharing this with me.
Thank you very much indeed, for everybody.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you
for having me.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Yes, I will
Bye,
be
Albert.
Bye. Goodbye.
Oh, nice to see
Thank
you.
you very much. I really
I hope we can keep the chat
Yes,
printed
yes.
so we
I'm
can
going
retrieve
I'm
it.
going to save the chat.
Good.
Yeah.
I was
It would be
hoping
great if we can keep the
Lynn,
chat.
I want to show you something. May I?
Yeah, go on. Yeah. Andre.
This is my Victoria College Cairo hat, believe it or
Oh,
not.
wow. Gosh, it's seen a lot.
Yes, it has.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. What a piece of memorabilia.
Exactly.
Maybe
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful program. I hope we can save the chat.
Yes, we
Stream.
will.
It would be important. Thank you so much. And I hope we can get the recording. Can we get the recording?
Yes, there'll be a video which I will actually upload to the Harif website. And it'll also be sent, the link will be sent to everybody on the mailing list.
Wonderful.
Okay. And is it going to be on YouTube? Lynn?
Yes,
Is it going to be on YouTube as well? It said
yes, I'm
someone
going
said
to convert the Zoom into a YouTube video. Yes. And you will definitely get it.
because I have people who couldn't be there but wanted to know.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
That's my
Thank
next
you.
job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again.